Hello, welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be doing a little art demonstration, and what this is the Bloodwork series I've been working on, and you can see here how I do pencil lines first of my text. I like to use a 2H pencil. I find that's really effective for doing really light lines that are easily erasable. And you can see right here, 2H. I really recommend them. Also, I love these Faber, Faber-Castell erasers. They're white and they're just fantastic at removing graphite without smudging or smearing things. You'll see here too that I have different lines that I've used a T-square to create, and that just gives me lines to work with when I'm doing my calligraphy. So I also really love these Faber-Castell India ink pens, and they come in all different tips. So this is a medium, so you can see it's a pretty fine line, but it does get smaller. This is a wider one. It's a 1.5, so you can see it has really nice thick lines. I love these pens because they have really rich pigment, they last for a good amount of time, and they're also waterproof, which is fantastic because some markers and stuff aren't, and so they'll bleed if they get wet. And if you're going for an aesthetic where you want the pigment to disperse like that in water, it can look really cool. But especially if you're trying to do things with fine line work, then that's not going to probably be your ideal, which is why I really love these. They work great for art journaling, or if you do sketching with watercolor and inks, then these are a really good option. And of course, for a project like this, where eventually we're going to be doing some water-based pigment to fill in the coloring on the letters, then again, it's great that they don't bleed. One thing you need to be careful of, for example, when working on paper like this, is it doesn't have a big texture or tooth to it. And so the paper itself is very, very smooth, which is great when you're filling in something like this with markers, because you don't have to press down as hard, but you'll get it on your hand like this. And so you need to be careful, and during the dark parts where there's a lot of ink, it will take a little bit longer to dry. And so you have to be aware of where your hand placement is so that you don't inadvertently start kind of smearing it around on your paper. Because it is a permanent color, it will definitely kind of stain your paper, which can be a pain. So that's just one thing to kind of be aware of. And I really love different fonts. I had never really played with them until I got into graphic design and stuff after college. But I think they're just fantastic the way that they can kind of create a feel or atmosphere just by the way the letters are drawn or by the way the letters are presented. It can seem really exciting, or it can be delicate, or it can seem meek and quiet or really intense. And just being able to do that with letters and not any sort of other visual elements or pictures is really fascinating to me. So this is another thinner tip. So you can tell my lines, my initial lines, aren't as wide as they were for the words don't, oh, and you. And I love to play with different script fonts. I think they're really pretty. I really don't use cursive in my daily life at all, but I do enjoy including it in various artworks. I used to hate my handwriting, But throughout this project, I've definitely had to learn to get more used to my ability to draw and lines and everything. So with this project, I include little visual designs and little kind of elegant accents like this. One reason is I really like the juxtaposition of these kind of pretty, dainty, feminine kind of ornaments, or it's not quite the right word, but these pretty visuals contrasting with kind of the heaviness of the message or the kind of seriousness of the message. I think that that's a nice contrast, especially when you add in the fact that it's painted with the menstrual blood. Another trick about it is when you do lettering like this, sometimes you may feel that it has too much negative space or the balance of the composition is kind of off. And so this gives you a great opportunity to kind of fill in spaces if they seem like there's too much blanks with other little elements so that everything kind of evens out in a way that you feel content with. And just finishing these little loops. And then we erase it. The thing to remember is, again, make sure the ink is dry. So you can kind of test it by just gently touching it and making sure it doesn't come off on your hand. If you move with the pigment, then you're not risking smearing it anywhere. As long as it's dry, you can just go in and erase any of those little 2H graphite lines should come off pretty easily. Again, that's why I really like this kind of eraser. I also find this part to be very satisfying, just kind of getting all that extra background stuff off of there, and you just have the very clean black and white lines. I always find that really, really satisfying. So once that is all taken care of, then it's time to come in with the paint. So obviously for this, I'm using the Menstrual Blood because that's kind of part of the point of this series. And ultimately, it's a lot like painting with watercolor. So if you've ever used watercolor, it's surprisingly similar. Acrylic is also a bit similar, especially like a watered down acrylic or gouache would have a similar result. I try to make sure that I'm changing my color up enough because I'm working in monochromatic, so everything is just kind of these different shades of sort of pink to deep red. And I like to really emphasize that you can have a lot of color variation. And so one thing I'll do is the gradation of the pigment within letters. So I'm making it really dark over here, kind of by the corner of the E. And then I'll add in some water, and that will really kind of pick up a little bit of the pigment that's already there, and I can just kind of move that down. So just kind of the water itself is what will transfer that color. And a little bit of paper towel, if I dab it up, will really, really lighten that. I do have to be careful that I don't make everything kind of overly gradated or use too much difference in color within the words, because then that can look really chaotic too. So for this one, I'm just using just a similar value of the pigment so that all these letters are going to be pretty much the same in color throughout. I'm probably going to add some stripes or something when it's dry. I've found really interesting ways that you can play with what the color will do when it's dry versus when it's wet. So I'm using a darker pigment here. So all that is just thicker. It's just more blood, for lack of a better word, that's less watered down. So because of that, it's just going to give you that richer, darker color. And it can be a little tricky when you're using really thick pigment because you have to have a lot of it on your brush, and because of that, you risk dripping it in places that you might not want drips. And if that happens, I just embrace it, and you'll notice some of these kind of have splashes and drips and stuff, and I do that anyway. So if something kind of drips or something, if like my hand kind of hits it and it ends up smearing it or something, it's fine because that's kind of an aesthetic that I've embraced with this. So the mistakes go right into what I'm doing on purpose with that. So it ends up being just fine. I have been going over some of the pure black, sort of like the right sides of the W here, these longer ones. I'm going over the black with the blood as well, just because you'll find it makes it a little bit darker and it creates an even sort of tone, an even richness, I think, with it, where the black can seem a hint dull once you get all of the paint in, or once you get all the pigment in there. So when you go over it with the blood, it kind of puts that same gloss finish that the blood inevitably makes on it. So I just find that's kind of like right here, it just kind of makes it a little darker. And let's see. So then with this, I'm using a really watered down, very, very watered down pigment, and just kind of making that damp in those areas because I'm going to play with gradient again. So as you can see, it has just a hint more color, a hint more color. And when it's still damp, the colors will kind of naturally bleed into each other a little bit, so it makes very gradual color shifts as long as I'm putting paint down on an already damp surface. You don't want it to be super wet. If it's really, really wet, then the color just kind of bleeds everywhere and it'll kind of make it a uniform color. But as long as it's a hint damp, it'll spread a little bit, but not too much. And as you can see on the P there, it was a little dry, so it's not spreading quite as much as it does on the R, which is kind of more what I was going for. And then you can just bring in some water. And if you take that water and just kind of brush it, it'll give you that color. And again, more dark pigment. And part of it is just kind of letting the water and pigment react to each other, just how it naturally does. So now I'm just kind of pulling some of this pigment back down where it's kind of damp. And I'll show you something here. So I put the wet on after on the second tee, and I put the plain water down first on the first tee, and you can kind of see almost how on the second tee the water is kind of pushing the pigment back up towards the top of the tee, and that's because it kind of makes this resist with the water. So now you can kind of see that. I just have to kind of change the angle sometimes working with the camera because I don't want to put my head in the shot. It's kind of tricky. So I'm just adding pure water, just kind of a little bubble of water with surface tension. So all these letters are dry now. And so when I just go over it with a thick line of water, what that will actually do is kind of rehydrate the blood and then almost push it to the sides because it's like the blood kind of wants to be with its buddies, sort of. And so it'll kind of just move the color out of the way and then leave these kind of little white, either white or much lighter pink lines. And I'll show you that in a second. And then these are just normal pigment lines, thick and thin, to add a little more visual interest to the letters. And again, I'm going to paint over the black just to kind of make that black more rich. You can kind of see the difference, for example, in the shadow in the N versus those dark black of the serifs in the W. You can see the kind of difference of one that has been gone over with the pigment and then the one that hasn't. So once I color this in with the blood, it's definitely a darker tone or value. And again, I just want to be a little careful here because I'm coloring it in, but I did add those little water lines here, and I want to avoid adding the blood to the water lines while they're still wet, because then it'll just bleed through. And the whole point of those water lines is to try to keep them free of the blood, and then it'll give me white, it'll give me a negative space. And so I have to keep them kind of very intentionally separated. So then right here, if we get a little bit closer, you can see how the lines have dried and you're kind of left with these lighter spots. And that's what just putting plain water on the dried blood does. So that's really fun. I like to play with that a lot. So then we can just kind of do some splatters, make things messy, just a little bit. I think that kind of emphasizes the fact that it's blood too, that kind of thing. And fill in the rest of these little bits, some little lines here, just to kind of add a little more visual interest. And that's how I've done my lettering pieces. If you want to see any more of my Bloodwork exhibition, then go to www.nakedcarlyart.wordpress.com, and there's a little tab that says Bloodwork Art Exhibition. Thanks so much for watching.